given what's happening here in the town, plus we have an election coming up. I just want to acknowledge we've got two city council members here, Randy Haney and Souza Francina. Yeah. And Bill Wyrick is coming. He's in a meeting now, but he's going to come afterwards. We've got two candidates. We've got a candidate for mayor, Anson Williams, right there.
Hey, guys.
And we've got James Forsythe. And James Forsythe, he's running for school board in Ventura.
All members. All members. Thank you.
We got Andy Whitman, too.
Oh,
Yeah, we have Mr. Whitman.
Oh, Andy Whitman. These masks are throwing people off. I didn't recognize you. Sorry about that. Anyone else running or planning to?
I got a bad knee. I can't run.
Oh, okay. Walk.
You're not Josh Hawley, then.
Bada bing.
So I just want to remind people who are getting involved in land use issues here in Ojai, which are critical for our future. On August the 2nd, right here at, I think, 5:30, there's going to be a workshop on land use and transportation, which is going to give input to the general plan on that area. Obviously, transportation is a big issue for us.
Excuse me, that people are talking, it's hard to hear when people are talking.
Okay. So, I'll just say it one more time. On August the 2nd, here, 5:30, the town, the planning commission is going to have a workshop on land use and transportation to sort of get citizen input for the general plan and our transportation element. And one other sort of club announcement on August the 5th, we have to man a booth, Democratic booth at the fair from 1 p.m. to 11 p.m. In Ventura. So if anybody would like to come down and help us out, we'll take volunteers.
What's that date?
August. Oh, Jesus. I need to be sent to, reform school here.
August 5th?
It's too late for that. Keep going.
August the 5th. It's a Friday. Sorry.
It's the Ventura County
Ventura
Democrats
County.
booth, and the Ojai Valley Democrat Club has the booth that day.
Yes, and if you're going to the fair, you can come by and see us.
Yes, you do.
Personal
You get in free. Work the booth.
You get it in free. That's right.
Free parking and free shuttle.
What we get, the shorter the shift.
Okay. The last announcement is
And
around.
There's a sign-up sheet for it in the front
Okay,
for the
okay.
fair. It's a lot of fun, you guys. Whoever likes the fair.
1 p.m. to 11 p.m. So
There's two
we're
shifts.
asking for people to like do 2-hour shifts.
No. 4 hours.
Well, to help out, we got it covered. We just need extra people.
We can do
So.
2-hour shifts if we have extra people.
At the Ventura County Fair, which is at the fairgrounds. You know where that is, I take it.
Passed it a couple times.
Oh, okay. I avoid it whenever I can. But anyway, so the next important thing I want to mention is the upcoming election. Obviously, everyone knows about it. Our club will be doing endorsements. We always do that, and we're having a fairly tight schedule for that because we have to get our endorsements into the Ventura County Endorsement Committee by August the 23rd, so that our endorsements become their endorsements. And when they send out their slate mailers, our endorsements will be on there. So the filing period ends on August the 12th. I will be completing and sending out to our board questionnaires. So as soon as I do that, hopefully by the end of this week, we will send out to everybody who's already filed. We're asking people to return them within 10 days. If you wait late enough to file, you're going to only have until August the 16th to complete your answers. And on August the 18th, we are going to have a debate forum here for all candidates who have filled out a questionnaire and are seeking the endorsement of the Democratic Club. And then
For the city council and for school board.
City Council and School Board, and if there's two Democrats running for a water district, we'll have them as well, against each other. And of course, just to remind you, or you probably may not know it, but Democratic Party rules say that we can only endorse a Democrat, a registered Democrat.
Wow.
And we don't make the rules, we have to follow them. And our bylaws say you have to have been a Democrat for 45 days before the end of the filing period.
Too late.
So you can't change now and try to run and get our endorsement. And then on the 21st, which is a Sunday evening, we will have a club meeting to vote on our endorsements. So the executive board of the club will have looked at obviously listened to the debates. We will score the answers to the questions, and then we will make recommendations to the club, and we will vote for endorsements. I think it takes 2/3 vote to be endorsed?
Yes.
Okay. And finally, as the election goes along, one of the principal things we will be doing is going door to door with door hangers and canvassing. Ojai is a small place, so that's fairly easy to do, and it's the best way to get your message out. And so we're going to be looking for volunteers who would like to do that. Some people think it's they're shy, or this might be scary or whatever. It's actually a very fun thing because most people are incredibly friendly. And then finally, somewhere around September the 10th or the 11th, we're going to do a fundraiser because it takes money to make a campaign done. Okay, that's all for announcements. Go ahead.
I wanted to mention that the Ojai Chautauqua is also going to have a council candidate forum on Wednesday, September 7th at Matilaha Auditorium, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m.
Did you get that?
Can you repeat it for the speakers?
I put that in her email.
That was in your email.
That was in your email, if you get the email, but I'd like Laura to make an announcement because the Ojai Valley News is co-sponsoring it, right?
Right. Andy Gilman has informed me that the Ojai Chautauqua for City Council Candidate Forum will be Wednesday, September 7th at Matilaha Auditorium. And he's thinking 5:30 to 7:30. Stay tuned to the Ojai Valley News for updates.
And get on our email list to stay tuned for updates.
Okay, we want to thank the Ojai Valley News for being here, Kimberly and Laura for videotaping us and all they do to keep us informed about issues. Yeah. Randy, you got a...
So I just had a question. We covered registration with the Democratic Party. Can you register the day that you're actually voting in the Democratic Club vote?
You cannot, you have to have registered as a Democrat 45 days before the filing period ends. And the filing period ends on August the 12th. Oh, voting, if you want to vote and you're a part of the Democratic Club, you have to have been a member for 30 days prior to that closing.
You have to be registered as a Democrat.
So,
Pardon?
Voting in the election.
Voting in our election, voting in our endorsement election.
endorsement election,
You have to be registered as a Democrat to be a member.
Yeah.
I'm asking about voting, like for a candidate,
Okay.
or voting in the Democratic Club.
Democratic Club.
Yeah, you had to have been a member for 30 days. And people who have, donated and maybe they're a little behind, they can catch up as long as they've been a member with their dues. But you got to catch up with your dues to vote.
so 30 days before the endorsement voting meeting,
Yes.
which is when?
No,
again?
30 days before the close of the filing period. Which was,
No, that's for candidates.
No, the same rule applies for No, it's in the bylaws. Okay, we're talking about two different things. One is to be eligible to be endorsed by us, you have to have been a Democrat 45 days before the end of the filing period. To be eligible to vote in our endorsement, you have to have been a member 30 days before the end of the filing period.
Join tonight.
Pardon?
Join tonight.
It's too late.
No,
Oh, it's too late?
no, Jeffrey. No, our bylaws say 30 days before the endorsement meeting.
Well, we'll check that, but that would even be, I don't think that's true, but we'll check it. Because I looked the bylaws up. Anyway, so tonight, we have a great speaker. And as many of us know, we've had a lot of controversy around affordable housing. And I think a lot of disinformation and misinformation or misunderstanding about the issues. But it's a complicated issue, clearly. Shane Phillips, who's speaking to us tonight, is a planner. He's the managing director of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Planning Studies. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California. He has incredible planning experience in different roles, including transportation as well. He has a dual master's in planning and public administration. And he has this book, which I read, which is great, The Affordable City. And it's called Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach. This is an incredible resource for anybody doing public policy for the city because it outlines a whole series of potential strategies, both for dealing with increasing supply, for stabilizing existing affordable units, and for subsidizing both developments and people who need affordable housing. So, with that, I will introduce Shane. Thank you.
I guess I should start by, I think this is going to be a little bit of a contentious topic, as housing always is. And so I will say, I'm coming to this in entirely good faith. I will have some views that are informed by evidence that you will probably disagree with, others which you will agree with. I think I got my Democratic bona fides, voted for Bernie in 2016, then Clinton. Warren in 2020, Biden. So I'm on your side, even if I say some things you don't like. I think you'll like most of it, but just this is a dicey topic, and I think part of it is because housing, a lot of people, I think, especially people more on the left, liberal, Democrat, whatever, we want to blame someone else, and we especially want to blame very rich people, very powerful people. And the fact is, from my perspective, it is mostly ourselves that are to blame. We are the reason that housing is so expensive. And we have the power to change it without having to completely dismantle capitalism, society. We can do something about it ourselves. And so, just to kind of outline this really quick, I want to start by kind of giving more of an overview of what is in the book. It's more big picture. Some of it, I will be honest, will not feel super applicable to Ojai just because I'll kind of get into why later on. But I think, Ojai, there are things you can do here and should do here, including allowing more housing to be built of various kinds. But I think there are valid questions about how much housing should go here versus the Bay Area, Los Angeles, other places where there are a lot more jobs, they're closer to the coast where the temperature and kind of the environmental benefits are bigger. There's more transit and so forth. And so I think, that's a conversation we can have at the end here, but there are certainly things to do here as well. So that's kind of how I'm going to break it down. And I want to start things off with a couple claims here. First, there is no such thing as a no-growth community. A lot of people want their communities to be no-growth, but it doesn't exist, and I will explain why in a moment. Another claim is that we focus too much on specific market or policy failures when we work on housing and land use. We try to solve this problem or that problem, and what we need to do is enlarge the problem, and again, I will explain what I mean by that. But to start with the no growth, there is no such thing as no growth. I think ultimately over the medium and the long term, there are really just three futures for every city. One is, this clicking actually works. Sorry. There we go. So you can grow your housing stock to meet rising demand. Sorry, I'm losing. Something is off here. Ignore this. You can grow your housing stock to meet rising demand. A lot of that demand, probably just people who happen to be born here or in the area, not always appreciate it. Or you can grow your housing prices. And that, so by not building housing, you will just have the growth take the form of higher housing costs, and that's where a lot of California cities are at. Or you could be a place that people don't really want to live, and you're probably already stagnating or in decline if that is your story. And I think that, given the choice between these three things, the first one is pretty obviously the right choice to make. It's just a hard choice. Another way of putting this is this image on the right. You've probably seen this kind of three overlapping Venn diagram thing before in different forms, but I adapted it for housing. I think you can have a city that is appealing, unchanging, and affordable, but you can only pick two. If your city is appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable. Think a place like San Francisco. If it's unchanging and affordable, it's probably because it's not appealing. So think Detroit. A lot of Rust Belt cities are dealing with this. And if it's appealing and affordable, it is not going to stay affordable for long if you don't build more homes and plan for a future with more neighbors. So this is a quote that I think is attributed to Eisenhower, but probably apocryphally. It's a useful quote in any case. If you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. And the basic idea here is that housing, like just about everything else in the modern world, or really in any time, is complicated. And trying to solve one problem will always create some kind of problems elsewhere. That's just the nature of the game. We can try to design policies and programs to minimize those unintended consequences, but sometimes you just have to do one thing, recognizing that it's going to cause some problems, and do a different thing to solve those problems. And that's really all that means, is enlarging the problem and tackling it all at once. So just as an example, in the housing world, if permitting more housing raises concerns about gentrification and displacement, the solution, when you need housing for a growing population, is not to permit less housing, it's to tackle those unintended consequences, gentrification, displacement, tackle those head on. So just some more examples of this. If you're concerned with that upzoning will displace renters, you can pair that upzoning. If people aren't familiar with the phrase upzoning, this is just changing the zoning to allow more housing on a given parcel, usually done in kind of a neighborhood-wide or corridor-wide context. You could pair that policy change with direct displacement protections that say you can't evict people for the purpose of building something bigger, and that's going to naturally direct development somewhere else. You can upzone broadly, So it's not just concentrated in one neighborhood, which tends to focus a lot of investment and change all in one place, and that does cause more displacement in many cases. And you can also prioritize parcels that don't already have housing on them, or in particular multifamily housing, where people are most likely to rent. And that's usually what we do in most of our cities, is we close off 80 or more % of the residential land to detached houses only. Nothing else is allowed to be built there. And we have 4plexes, 8plexes, and the parcels, maybe you can build 20 or 40 units on them. And then we act surprised or angry that people are being displaced from those homes when we've given no other alternatives for where to build. Similarly, if you're concerned that rent stabilization will suppress housing supply, rent stabilization, rent control, you could pair with upzoning to actually create capacity elsewhere. You can change the policy, you can adapt it, design it kind of carefully in different ways, one of which is to exempt new units, because applying rent stabilization or rent control to new housing is the surest way to stop development. But if you just exempt it and roll the housing into it after it's been around for 15 or 20 years, developers mostly don't care. They'll still build in that context. You can also just increase the speed and certainty of housing approvals, because that is a major barrier itself. And so if you're creating something of a barrier here, we're going to reduce some barriers over here. So getting to the book, the main message of the book, really the theme of it is these 3 S's of supply, stability, and subsidy. And really the main message is that supply alone is not going to fix our problems. Neither will stability policies like rent control, eviction protections, and so forth. And neither will subsidies, housing vouchers, rent assistance, things like that. But together, each of these policies can be, and often is, mutually reinforcing, with the strengths making up for kind of the weaknesses of others. So it's that enlarging the problem idea. And so I'm going to focus here on supply because I think it's the most disagreeable, controversial, especially among people in my political camp. But I view the supply issue, this is really just making sure that we have enough homes for not just the people who live here now, but a growing population, and also a population with changing needs. More and more households are living alone, both younger and older. So even if we were not growing our population at all, we might need more housing in that context. But it's recognizing 2 things. Physical constraints, just the fact that growing and changing populations require a growing and changing stock of homes. We can't just keep what we have and kind of keep reshuffling it around all the time. It doesn't work. And economic constraints, the reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords get rich at the expense of home buyers and renters. That is how it has always worked. Even in the context of rent stabilization, you throw the best protections that you can. In the long run, this is still where things always end up when housing is scarce. I'm just going to throw a bunch of charts at you. Hopefully these are somewhat visible here. This one's really just focused on Tokyo specifically. Tokyo is a metropolitan area of about 40 million people, almost exactly the same population as California. Japan is shrinking in population. Tokyo is still growing. They build 5 times more housing per capita than California. And if you look on the right, house prices and population over from 1995 to 2015, they basically haven't grown at all. They're the second set there, Tokyo. Minato-ku is a ward within Tokyo, and it's seen a little more growth over that time period, but not nearly as much. Part of this is inflation. Inflation is basically 0% in Japan, but it isn't mostly not inflation. It's just the fact that housing is pretty affordable there, and in large part because they just keep building more and more to make sure that as they grow, there are places for people to go. Meanwhile, you can see places like San Francisco and New York, which have built very little over the past several decades, have climbed, double, tripled in prices over the same time period. And I think it's really important to note, this is not just about prices. We can sometimes focus on affordability and concerns about gentrification and displacement, and that's my game. I love to do it, but we don't always think about the fact that like building more housing is an opportunity to make people's lives better. And in Japan in particular, this is the Tokyo prefecture specifically, you can see that over the past 50 years, they've doubled the amount of floor space per person. It's still actually a pretty small amount of floor space, 30 square meters. This average household size, so it's like, it's up to like 400, 500 square feet. Still pretty small, but that's double what it was before. And they were able to do that because they kept building. If they had just kept what they had, they'd still be living in extremely cramped quarters. Here in, this is a chart from, on the left is housing permits in the Minneapolis metro area. They've really climbed a lot over the past 10 years or so to nearly historic levels, which is fairly uncommon in the US. We're pretty far below previous decades. And on the right here is just over the past couple of years, their housing prices, their rents have basically flatlined. And that is not the story of most metro areas in the country. And they're continuing to grow. They have a strong economy there. It is in large part, if not solely, but in large part, because they built a lot of housing. Vacancies are a very good indicator of where rents in particular are going. So all of these things are really showing the same thing, which is that when the vacancy rate is high, the rate of rental growth, the rate at which rents go up, is very low, and vice versa. So you can see here we have Austin on the top left, Dallas, Fort Worth on the bottom left, Seattle is the middle one, where you've got high vacancy rates in the red, and green is the rent growth goes very low. They just are inverse of each other. And the same thing with Denver here, and the same thing nationwide. I actually looked at this, I got some data myself for this, looking at things in a little different way, which is how many quarters over the past 8 years or so have each of the top 30, the largest 30 metro areas in the country, had a vacancy rate, rental vacancy rate of under 5%, which is considered the point at which you're in really short supply, because there's just a lot of moving around at any given time, so you need some slack there. And it's a very clear trend where places that have had, on the left, very few quarters of below 5% vacancy rates, pretty affordable. As you move to the right, more and more quarters out of the year that have had low vacancy rates, and they've had a lot more growth over that 2012 to 2019 period. Got a few more here, really want to drive this point home. This is just some tech hubs from a while back, looking at housing permits or construction permits, units per 1,000 existing units compared to median prices per square foot for housing. The places like Raleigh and Austin that are building just a lot compared to others, relatively affordable. And of course, the places that are building very little, like San Jose and San Francisco, are the most expensive. This is maybe the most powerful one for me, just looking at the orange dot and the green dot. This is housing permits issued per 1,000 residents, so per capita basically. Over those two time periods from 1990 to 2007 compared to 2008 to 2018. And every single metro area in this list is doing less than it was a few decades ago. And if you look at almost the very bottom, Los Angeles is right, three from the bottom. It wasn't doing much before either. It actually was, I think, last place. And we fell a little bit down to third place somehow. We thought we declined, but some places, basically we're being beaten by Chicago and Detroit. And there's a lot more demand to live in Los Angeles. We are not building less because people don't want to live here. We're building less because we are choosing to build less. This is something that I think this is like such an interesting work that these folks at BuildZone did. Basically, this is looking at over 20-year periods, 1940 to 1960, then 1960 to 1980, 1980 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2016. Where is development happening and what does it look like? And they have this for Los Angeles metro area, but they have it for all over the country. And what you see is the light blue is single family homes, the orange is 2 to 49 unit structures, dark red is 50 plus unit structures, and dark blue is just places where really nothing Five homes? Okay, so yeah, that would qualify as almost no construction, I think. I think the situation with used cars is a really useful kind of metaphor or analogy for this. We all know, pandemic happened, car production kind of went off a cliff for a bit, and very quickly, within just a few months, prices on used cars climbed something like 15%. And within about a year and a half, prices had declined by 50%. I think the metaphor to housing is pretty clear here. We stopped building housing 30 to 40 years ago at the rates that we used to. We were building per capita a third to a half as much as we used to. And part of that is the fertility rate is lower. We're having fewer children. There's just not as much demand as there once was. But I can tell you demand is not half what it once was. And actually, part of why the fertility rate is lower is because it is very expensive to have kids, and it is very expensive to have kids in large part because housing is so expensive. And so our housing crisis is sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy where we're not meeting the needs of our children, and it's causing us to have less children in a sense. Yeah. Does someone have?
Does the baby boom have anything to do with this? I mean, the baby boomer.
There were a lot of baby boomers. There are, I think, even more millennials, and I think there are even more than that, Gen Z. So baby boomers were a huge boom for the time, but just because population has continued to grow, the later generations are still bigger. Gen X is smaller, but there are more millennials than baby boomers even before they started passing away, and same with Gen Z, I think. And I'm just throwing this in because it will probably come up, it always does, and I think it's an especially valid thing to bring up here. Water scarcity as a reason for not building homes is not a very good excuse. I will not pretend to know the exact situation here. The situation in Los Angeles is surely not exactly the same as what it is here. But I use this as an example just to show that population growth and increased water usage are not a given by any means, just like population growth and economic growth and greenhouse gas emission growth are no longer linked together. Los Angeles between 1970 and today, or even 10 years ago, grew by over 1 million people. Over that time, its total water use actually fell slightly, and its per capita water use fell precipitously. Maybe that's kind of a pun, I guess. I didn't intend to do that. Precipitation did also fall, yeah.
It's my understanding that 80% of the water, and somebody correct me if I'm mistaken, goes to agriculture.
Yeah, that's right.
And then of the 20% for housing, 10% of that is landscaping, which we can mitigate.
Yeah.
And then we can do, you know, water saving infrastructure in the
Yeah.
houses.
And this is
Yeah.
part of why building more housing often can reduce or kind of even out water use, because if you replace like a single family house that has a big lawn with a multifamily building that doesn't have a lot of landscaping or has like more kind of appropriate landscaping, not a big lawn, you can actually have less water use even though 5 times more people are living there. So just some supply policy examples. You know, things like just allowing more housing on your commercial corridors if you're kind of protective of the more inner, more kind of residential oriented neighborhoods. This is always an option, and of course it means less displacement because generally people don't already live on these corridors. Zoning for increased density across wide swaths of the city. I've written about this in a few different contexts, but I talked about how over time housing has really been, new housing has been concentrated into just a few small areas. For one, that creates the kind of development that people tend not to like very much. We tend to be more okay with like the 3-4 story kind of, you know, missing middle stuff that people built 30, 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago. It also means that you can have more small developers like we're seeing with ADUs and so forth, rather than just the big ones who are really the only ones who can do these larger developments. And making more home building by right. And I can talk more about this later, but my point with this is everything we do now is discretionary, and you know, this development agreement, I know it is kind of part of that story. Even start, they're not going to bother. That kind of housing is not going to be built, and it's not being built. And beyond that, I think, you know, I'm curious to hear later on what people's kind of experience of this development agreement negotiation process was for those who were involved. But my colleague Mike Manville at UCLA has done some research finding that a lot of the quote-unquote growth revolts, these ballot initiatives that California communities have passed over the years, opposing housing and kind of making it harder to build, they have come up after these kinds of fights where cities create a plan. Every city has to have a plan in their housing elements that says, here's what we expect for future growth. And then when developers show up and propose something, those plans go out the window and it's all just a big negotiation. And that, you know, can feel, especially from an elected official perspective, like you're getting something for the community, and you get a win that you get to take back to them. I'm not going to say that's not true to some extent, but what is also true is it completely erodes faith in the planning process. There's no real reason to trust that the plan that you might have showed up to multiple meetings to help form is actually going to be stuck to. And it gives the impression that everything is up for negotiation, these backroom deals, what did they get in exchange for this, what did they do in exchange for that. It's just not a great way to do planning, and I think just as a general, you know, aside from being good for affordability, I think it's good to do planning, make plans, get consensus, and then just stick to them. And if someone shows up wanting to build something that complies with those rules that you all agree to, you just let them do it. Does one make anyone raise their hackles?
We'll wait for the end.
I think did you just,
We'll wait for the
Reduce
end.
or eliminate parking, you didn't say anything about it.
you skipped a slide maybe.
Oh, this was, yeah, well, reduce or eliminate parking minimums. I think this would be a challenge here, I'm sure. But I don't know, I'd be curious. Almost everywhere that they have evaluated actual developments that have been built in places with parking minimums, they find that the parking is never full, especially in residential buildings. Even, you know, middle of the night on a Wednesday where you'd expect everyone to be home, everyone to be parked. Most places it's 60, 70% full. And, you know, that might seem like a nice buffer to have, but the reality is that those spaces cost a lot, especially if they're above or below ground. We're talking $40,000, $50,000 per space. And that works out to $200, $300 additional rent per month. The fact that you're not paying for the parking space directly does not mean you're not paying for it nonetheless, because it's not just coming out of the developer's pocket. They wouldn't build the building if they didn't think they could recoup that cost through your rents. impacts of reform. My colleagues and I actually did some research on Los Angeles' transit-oriented communities program. This is basically a sort of builds on the state density bonus program, which allows you to build taller, more densely, higher floor area, reduced parking. In exchange, you have to provide on-site below-market units that are deed restricted for 55 years. That's pretty common for density bonuses. This one's just a little more generous. But what it also did was increase the threshold under which projects could be approved by right. So they don't have to go through city planning, they don't have to go through planning commission meeting. Again, if they meet the statutory requirements, all the regulations, they just get a permit. It still takes months, but it's maybe 6 months instead of 14 months or 12 months instead of 30 months. It's a lot faster. And so what we found was, indeed, it was a lot faster, and that's the by right TOC here is the kind of quickest ones. And that means that projects can actually be built less expensively because the investors have a shorter amount of time that their profit expectations are just accruing. You know, if you're getting a 10% return every year, completing a building from start to finish in 3 years means it's only accrued for 3 years, 35% or something like that. If it's a 7-year project, it's accruing that 10% return expectation every year. At the end of 7 years, it's almost 100%. And that goes into their planning on what they actually think they can build profitably. And if they don't think they can make that kind of return, you know, doubling the money they invested up front basically, then they're not going to move forward with the project in the first place. And that's not like a greed thing. It's just the fact that, well, if I can get 10 or 12% in the stock market and count on that, the S&P or whatever, then why would I take all this risk in a development that's going to be a lot more work and not even get the same returns? San Diego also increased its density bonus in 2016, and they later combined this with parking reductions in 2019, where basically they eliminated requirements in certain parts of the city. And I think things like this are seen as like a giveaway to developers. But what we saw in San Diego is that the biggest beneficiary was below market developers. And the number of below market, so basically reserved for low income households and rented at prices that are affordable to them, the number of those units within density bonus projects increased almost 6-fold after this reform. Because suddenly all these projects that were not feasible with a bunch of parking that the residents frankly didn't even use anyway were actually profitable to build. Or not even profitable in the case of a nonprofit developer, it was just the fact that they could get the money for it. They could afford it suddenly.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Are the city allowed to say you can only have 1 car per home, or are there people allowed to have 1 or 2, as many cars as they want in this situation?
You definitely can't tell people how many cars they can have. There are different ways of handling that kind of thing though. Like you can have a parking district in the neighborhood, and you could only give the building, you know, the same number of parking passes as any other building, because maybe they have the same street frontage or whatever. And so basically, if you have a car, but you're not parking in the building, you can't really park on the street either, so you're not going to move there. And I think that's an important thing to note. One of my other colleagues has done some research finding that when people, this is in San Francisco, but people who had cars and did not live in particularly transit accessible parts of San Francisco, when they were placed into below market housing, which some of you may know works through a lottery system because the demand is so high, only about 1% of applications get approved. And so if you win, you're moving in, whether it has parking or not. Whether it's exactly where in San Francisco you want to live or not, you're going to move in because the rent is like a fifth what it would be on the market. And they find that the people who move into the buildings with less parking, even if they have a car when they move in, by the end, a year later, 6 months later, the people in buildings with fewer parking spaces, they own fewer cars and they drive less often. So this has been a question for a long time, like, do buildings with less parking Are they just associated with less parking because they're attracting a certain, or with less driving and car ownership? Do they just attract the kind of people who would want to do that? Or do they actually encourage people to drive less and maybe get rid of their cars? And it looks like it's the latter, which is really a positive thing.
Let's hold the questions till the end. You can run them down.
Yeah.
We can get through it.
So Auckland, New Zealand, reformed its zoning in 2016 after a years-long process. And this is the result. The left, the purple and blue, is the areas that are zoned for multifamily. And the light blue on the right is the areas zoned for single family. Very small share of the city in the end that is single family only. And most of it allows at least 2 to 4 units, if not higher density. And production grew just exponentially. This is, you can see very clear, this is one of the most clear findings in any paper I've ever seen, just a sharp increase in production. And actually the authors are working on how this actually affected prices, but I did look just over the past few months, and I noticed that among the 6 regions in New Zealand, Auckland does now have the slowest rent growth of any of them. So that was a lot about supply, and I emphasize it just because, again, I think it's more controversial and frankly more in your control here than some of these other things, even though these things are also things you can do. Stability for me, it might not surprise you that when I came to housing policy, I really was focused on supply, and I thought it was pretty much the only thing that mattered. And things like rent control and displacement protections, I understood where it came from, but I also recognized that they have costs, and sometimes they can discourage development, and in the long run, maybe cause more harm than good. I've pretty strongly changed my tune on that. I think that's all true to this day, but I also have learned that you can design policies in ways that minimize those negative impacts, and that the positive impacts of these policies just cannot be overstated. I think, I said with supply that it's really about acknowledging these economic and physical constraints. I think stability is about acknowledging our moral obligations and asking ourselves, in the richest country in the world, the richest large country anyway, what is the minimum level of security and dignity that every person should have in their home, regardless of tenure, whether they own or rent?
May I please ask a burning question?
Yeah.
It goes with supply.
Mm-hmm.
How do you prevent investors from buying up the supply? Can you have a policy because that is one among the top problems in Ohio?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a different problem here too, because this is sort of like a vacation destination and that kind of thing. And, I think there are, on the corporate side, there are certainly things that can be done to just basically not allow those kinds of acquisitions. I'm not sure they're easy to do, but they have been done. On the, I think to the extent that these homes are being bought for short-term rentals,
They're banned.
you need to ban those. Yeah.
Well, we say we ban them, but
Right. You need to enforce it as well. Yeah.
We enforce it.
hang on. We have a 30-day
Mhm.
loophole,
Mhm.
and that is completely wiping out. That's why I'm homeless. Because the house, an investor bought my house. I've been homeless now. I'm technically homeless. I'm not sleeping on the street. I'm staying with a friend.
Yeah.
Stuff in storage, that kind of thing. This is a typical Ojai scenario. Every single day, I bet this happens almost every day, because almost every day there's someone displaced and moving out of Ojai for this very reason.
Yeah.
The house is sold. The rent went up from $1,650 to $4,000 a month after 3 months, paint job. Just
Right.
Same house.
Mm-hmm. I'm guessing it was sold like the owner passed away or moved away or something.
No.
That's usually when it
out of
happens,
state,
is
an
ownership change.
Not here in Ojai. It happens for all kinds of reasons. I've been tracking it for 9 months, about 9 months. There's a little house in back that I tried for 3 months to get, because I figured at least that would be less than $4,000. it became a 30-day short-term rental.
Mm.
And this is happening.
When you say
all
30-day,
Yeah,
like-
they can technically, within the city limit,
Mhm.
we have, if you go, you can easily go to, what's that website, you know, where they have.
Airbnb.
Yeah, Airbnb, you will see all this so-called 30-day short-term
oh,
rentals.
so it's rented for at least 30 days.
Kind of rough, yes.
Yeah,
At
okay.
least.
Okay.
But, or it can be less, but technically, they can't rent to another party until the 30 days is over.
Yeah,
But this is, you know, they can fudge it.
yeah.
They can
I mean,
totally fudge it.
that seems like that should be mostly eliminated or capped or something as well,
Well, we're
which would make a
trying,
big
but
difference.
it's.
Yeah, you could just change it to
is-
60 days or something,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. And I mean, there's other things too, like that have not been explored as much. But I think, you know, my view is like, especially when we're in the midst of a housing crisis, as much as we do need to build housing, that's a long-term project. We need solutions, and this is part of what the stability and subsidy stuff is about. Like, we have to do something now too. And in addition to, you know, making short-term rentals much harder to do, outside of like, I'm on vacation for 2 weeks and want to rent my place, I think that should be okay. But like, that's it, you know. But like taxing people for their second homes, I think that's,
Yeah, I
you know,
tried to bring that up.
we actually
Yeah.
give tax breaks to second homeowners in California.
Second home.
We let them write off their mortgage interest, just like the federal government does for first homes. But we do it for second homes. Of all things, that is costing us money
Yeah.
to subsidize people who own more than one home. So there are lots of things we can do. But to come back to stability, you know, essentially, I think we sometimes talk about tenants as though they are kind of the grease in the machinery of the housing market, and if they have to get ground up and shit thrown out in order for us to make sure we build enough housing and everything kind of runs smoothly, then so be it. And like, that's so obviously wrong, and we don't need to do that. And there are many places around the world where, again, Tokyo is a good example actually, where they're building tons of housing, constantly improving the quality of their homes, in part because of earthquakes. And they have rent stabilization, they have very strong protections against eviction. These things are compatible, but we come up with excuses for why it's not. And just for some examples, rent stabilizing older housing, I know rent control is a touchy subject, but the reality is that the major negative impacts of rent control are basically when it causes new housing not to be built or existing housing to be converted from rental into owner occupancy, like condoization, that kind of thing. If you only apply it to older housing and if you keep building new housing, such that there's not really an advantage to condoization, you can just build a new one rather than converting, this doesn't really become a problem anymore. Again, not to say it doesn't happen at all, not to say it has no downsides, but I really think it's underappreciated, especially among people who own their homes, that not knowing if you're going to live in the same home next year, not knowing if your rent is going to be $600 or $1,000 or $1,500 higher 3 years from now, is a real source of stress. In the same way as, you know, if you were living, you know, you're 65 years old and you didn't have health insurance, you don't know what's going to happen. You have to worry about what the future holds, and we don't have to live like that. Another one is limiting low yield redevelopments, and what I just mean by that is these situations where you take 4 units and replace them with 5, rather than taking 4 units or 1 unit and replacing it with 20 or more. Those kinds of things, they often result in higher priced housing and not more units, so there's really no benefit there. And then another one, this is a little more narrow, but requiring some kind of right of return or negotiated buyouts for people who are displaced. I don't know how much this is even necessary in Ohio, like how many people get displaced for redevelopment specifically here, as opposed to just so people can make more money on their unit or something. But when that happens, I think it is sometimes necessary, especially in built-out places where you don't have a lot of just completely undeveloped land. You can make people whole in that situation if you allow them to move into the new building at their previous rent, if you negotiate a package of, you know, like, you can leave if we pay you this much. those things can be mutually beneficial. So last is subsidy. This is really just, what gaps are not addressed by supply and stability. Because we can have, for-profit developers, frankly, meet a lot of our needs. They did in the past for decades and decades and decades. And, but they're not going to produce housing that is affordable to very low-income households, extremely low-income households, unhoused people. Like, we have to just spend money on that. There's no way around it. And similarly, stability policies, it's good for your rent to only go up by the inflation rate or whatever it is every year. But like, what if you don't have a home right now? Those kinds of stability policies are not really helping you. Let's go over that. There's just some examples here. Progressive transfer taxes. This is basically when you sell a property, you pay some percentage, 2, 3, 4%, to the city, often for some kind of affordable housing purpose. This is, Santa Monica's done this, Bay Area's done this in many cities. Culver City down in LA has done this. The city of LA is actually considering this. It's going to be on the ballot in November, and it would raise about $800 million a year in a city with a budget of about 11 or 12 billion, so it's a very significant amount of money. Just on sales of normal homes, it's actually only going to be on sales of properties worth $5 million or more, and it's still going to raise that much money. Because there's just so much money being made, not mostly from developers, just property owners, people buying a home 5 years, 30 years ago, and doing nothing, frankly, just happening to live in the right place at the right time, getting fabulously rich. And so asking them to pay back 5% of that, to kind of chip in to help the people who haven't benefited so much, I don't think it's asking too much.
Would that go into like a dedicated housing trust?
It depends on the initiative. The ones that have been passed so far, mostly not, because this is like a California tax law thing, and it's no longer the case. But before 2019, 2020, if you wanted to dedicate tax funds to a specific purpose, how would it be a special tax, is what that is?
A supermajority, right?
You had to have a supermajority. But if it was a general, you could just do a majority.
Dedicated housing trust?
Yeah. But now, because of some court decisions, if it's a voter-initiated ballot initiative, it can be a special tax, and it only needs a majority vote. And so that's what actually the city of LA is doing.
And that law applies because we have a school system, parcel tax. The government can initiate the initiative.
Well, that's the thing, is if the government initiates it, then it
No,
needs that
they can
supermajority.
stop, as long as they do an initiative.
By petition, it's regular majority.
Yeah. They can both do it. It's just if the government does it, it's a higher threshold, which is like
Well,
2/3 is a very high threshold.
And the parcel tax is the same. A school could have an initiative. They still have to get the same signatures.
Yeah.
So
There's probably different rules for the school too, because
I see.
the state has lowered the threshold on various kind of
That was a
preferred
court
taxes.
decision as well.
Yeah. And investing in public land, I think we tend to, and what I mean by that is buying land that is currently privately owned that we want to do something with. I think I'm someone who thinks that the market has a role to play, and it has done a lot of positive things in the past when we allow it to. But I also recognize that it's not going to do everything we need, that we do need to invest our own money, and that just waiting on whatever property owner happens to be ready to sell at some given moment is not always the best strategy. And it's very piecemeal, happenstance kind of approach. And sometimes if you have a bigger plan, you need to take some more proactive actions. I think of the three S's, supply, stability, and subsidy, as sort of a three-legged stool, if you're familiar with the metaphor, just very stable when you have all three in place. Remove just one, it topples right over. And, what I think about this, so supply without stability is really, so imagine just building a ton of housing, but the people who live in that community have no protections. Could cause a lot of displacement, certainly just a really fast pace of change that might be jarring and unpleasant. And then supply without subsidy, you're just leaving behind poor people. Because again, the market by itself, it can produce enough to keep prices stable and maybe even lower them a little bit. But when new houses cost $600,000, $800,000 to build, that's not going to be immediately affordable to a below market household. It's just not. You have to have subsidies for that kind of thing. On the stability side, stability without supply or without subsidy is really, all those policies are managed decline. They are keeping things from getting bad as quickly, but stability policies, again, rent stabilization, eviction protections, things like that, they don't make things better. And that is not a knock on them. It's just not their purpose. They exist to keep things from getting as bad as quickly. They're a treatment for symptoms, but they are not treating the cause. And then on the subsidy side, if you're pouring a bunch of money into it, but say you're not building enough housing, then it's just going to make all the existing housing a lot more expensive. And so it becomes this black hole. And we've seen this in Los Angeles, where we passed a $1.2 billion bond measure to build a bunch of supportive housing for unhoused residents. When it passed, we were estimating that a unit would cost $350,000, and that was about what it cost in 2017 or 2016. And now in 2022, it's $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a unit. These are units that are like 300, 400 square feet, the most bare bones thing you can imagine. They have community center and some services and stuff on site, but just so much money. And it is because the broader market, we're putting a lot of money into this, but we didn't address the bigger issues. Housing has remained scarce, people keep moving, jobs keep coming to the region, and we're still only building like 15,000 homes a year in a city with 1.4 million households. Yeah.
I guess you need a fourth leg, sensibility. When you're talking now to unhoused, $800,000 is where we are now.
Yeah.
Per unit. We're not talking about affordable.
Right.
We're not talking about welfare, subsidy. We're talking about unhoused living in a tarp. And we're spending $800,000, which is the single most expensive residential housing in America.
Yeah.
And that's what it's costing in LA.
Yeah.
So $800,000 for a unit smaller than a normal two-car garage.
Yep.
Is absolutely disgusting. And that's the reason people don't want to go with this. They see inept,
Yeah.
they see graft, they see
Yeah, there's some
theft,
corruption behind
they
those
see
costs.
pandering.
I actually don't think there's a lot of corruption going on there.
Done-
It's just a very bureaucratic process. We've made it very
People
expensive to
making
build.
money, the soft costs keep increasing as
Yeah.
a percentage of hard costs, that's a form of corruption.
Okay.
What about the
Okay,
tiny
this,
homes?
this whole question.
I got a few more. I'm going to get to some somewhat Ojai specific stuff here. One thing I do want to note, though, this is a little bit different because of kind of the nature of Ojai's problems and like how it can become. I think places that are popular with tourists are a little different than, I'm thinking of this more in the context of somewhere like Los Angeles. But there are so many places in the U.S. that would love to be a place that people want to go. And it is a very hard thing to turn around if you are not a place that people want to live or work. And I'm not trying to discount the challenges you have here, but you at least have something to work with. You can take that demand and literally build something with it. And so, I would encourage you to think about that as a strategy. How do you turn that energy into something positive? Because it won't just happen. You do have to plan for it. So quickly here, some Ojai stuff. You're probably familiar with the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. This is the sort of plan coming down from the state to the regional government, to the cities. The SCAG region, which is the 6 counties excluding San Diego in Southern California, we're supposed to plan for almost more than 1.3 million homes over an 8-year period. Ojai has only 53 of those, 0.004%, so it is not a big burden. But, should Ojai build more than that? I would say probably yes. 53 homes is probably not going to meet the rising demand over an 8-year period here. But, I brought this up at the beginning. Should the city, which is relatively isolated, I don't think there's a ton of jobs in this area. I assume transit isn't great, because how could it be? There's just not enough density. Is this really the kind of place that California should be directing a lot of its growth? I think that's a fair question to ask. I will note, I just picked a random Google Maps, Google Street View. Like, you could fit 3 times 53 homes in this parking lot. So, like, there's space for sure. And if you wanted to do it in 2-story, 3-story buildings that weren't too obtrusive, spread it out over a couple of these things, you'll get there in no time. But I'm hesitant to go down this road, but I do think it's worth asking, how much housing should go here. But then, even if there's agreement that maybe a lot of housing should not be built in Ojai because it doesn't meet, long-term sustainability goals or agglomeration and economic growth goals or what have you, I do think it's important to acknowledge that it does not absolve the city or its residents or the region of responsibility for the housing crisis just because you personally may not be suffering from it, and maybe this is not the place that should be helping solve the supply issue. Sorry.
To your comment about
Sure.
transit. What we do have is a city where everything, for those of us that live within, is within 3 miles.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a walkable bicycle city, and we're fighting really hard to have the infrastructure to support that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's, and I heard you say that you can't legally limit the number of cars. Well, I would challenge that because there are developments in different cities. There's no cars, no car developments, and
Well, they have no
No
parking.
park.
Yeah. People still show up with cars, is my point.
Yeah, but I mean, I didn't finish my train of thought. They have a car sharing program.
Yeah.
They have
That does help.
access to transportation, but they don't use the land, the valuable land,
Yeah.
for parking.
Yeah. I'm like 2 more slides and then I can. So
I have a lot of questions.
I do think I'm ready for it. The reality is that when places like LA and San Francisco fail to build enough housing, in particular, they've added a lot of jobs and not nearly as many homes. And so, what else could be the result of that other than a housing shortage and rising prices? But the problems of that, they overflow to places like Ojai. People are forced out of here, out of LA, for example, and they come here, some of them. And also, even people who are not forced out, because we have failed so badly in our cities, not just in California. When people do leave, say they retire or whatever, they're selling a home worth $1 million, $2 million, and they can take that to more affordable places, which even Ojai would qualify for if you're leaving the Bay Area, for example, and just flood those places with money and outbid everyone, and that brings up the price of housing for everyone. And so it's really this double-edged sword. So where I'm going with all of this is make a case, if you like, that Ojai should not be building a lot of housing. But if you're going to make that case, you also have to actually get involved in regional and state reforms that are going to ensure that the housing that is needed is built where it is needed, and not just kind of say it's someone else's responsibility and leave it at that. Because you're seeing the results of cities doing exactly that. LA also has not taken responsibility. But it's interesting. There's quite a few urban legislators in the state who want to see more housing built in our urban centers where transit is good and where there's lots of jobs, and especially in historically exclusionary, like overwhelmingly white communities that are not overwhelmingly white by chance. But they don't have enough allies, and they're not going to get enough allies from the suburbs, because the suburbs are always the most opposed to this kind of thing. But they can get support from rural areas, and I'm not sure what I would consider itself exactly, but like you're borderline rural, you're surrounded by rural anyway. And I think there's a holy alliance potential there, where basically Ojai legislators and other places like it say, yeah, upzone LA, upzone Bay Area, upzone San Diego, build as much housing as you like there. And that's going to be good for California, it's going to be good for you, it's going to be good for the country. And so there is an opportunity there, I think. This is just showing the change in housing built over the decades and just the steep decline. This is LA County, but just to make the point that it is all cascading outward as we're not building enough in places like that. I'll skip some other reasons to build housing. We can talk about it if you like. I do want to talk about this just briefly. So, what you can do. The second one is the push for state reforms. The first one I think is a really important starting point for any city, which is figuring out some kind of committee or something, commission, whatever you want to call it, getting a lot of interests, architects, builders, nonprofit and for-profit, tenant groups, environmental groups, faith groups, community-based organizations, everyone you can, labor, in a room, get some representatives from all of them, and come up with a good faith plan, build consensus, and stick together with that coalition through implementation. Seattle has done a very good job of this, actually, where they did exactly that, and they built a coalition around that initial group. And 5 years later, they actually achieved a lot of it. It wasn't just a plan that went on a shelf and nothing really came of it. And it really did fit into kind of a supply stability subsidy framework where they did a little bit or even a lot of all three. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I think you can use, whether you like some of the state laws that have passed or not, ADU laws, SB 9, which allows lot splits in 2 units on each lot. The law is the law, but you can take what it says and you can say, I don't like lot splits and 2 units on each, but you can change things. You can say, well, I'm just going to allow 4 units on a lot, but it has to be designed in this or that way that actually meets our needs, that is closer to what you actually want to see in your community. You could even say, in some places we're going to allow 6 units on a lot, and what that's going to do is take the heat off the places you don't want SB 9 to be used, because the places where you can build 6 are going to be the more attractive place to redevelop. So there's opportunities there, to take something you don't like and at least improve on it. All right. I have a bunch of primer questions here, but I don't think we're going to need any primer for them. So I'll just go to the thank you and my contact info.
So I have passed out cards. Put your hand down, Bob. We're going to do cards first. He's going to come and pick them up. And then we'll do, once he's finished with that, you can write. I just wanted to say a couple of things about this issue. Because I've been working on it a bit lately. We talk about a lot of crises. We hear about the climate crisis and the water crisis and so forth. But I don't know that there's much more immediate existential crisis than affordable living here in Ojai. Maybe not for those of us who have a home, but there's half of the population is eligible for affordable housing, and close to half of it is paying more than they should pay per month. And I think one thing we don't think about, we always think about what are the negative consequences of doing something. If we do some infill or so forth. We don't think about the negative consequences of not doing anything. And we have been doing that here for 2 decades. 5 houses in 12 years. 0 deed-restricted houses in a decade and a half. There's no way that when you keep having more demand, you can blame it all on people coming from LA, but there's something that maybe Shane can explain called a filtering process, where as you someone sells the house where Sousa was living in, then that makes another house sell for more. It works its way down to pretty soon there are no affordable housings at all. We're becoming a gated community if we don't do something about it. There are a lot of infill places to build, and I would just say this: affordable housing actually program for climate change protection and a climate program for sustainability. For an example, stopping all the people that commute here. 86% of the people that work, the city of Ojai, commute from out of the valley. What if a couple hundred of those didn't? Your biggest pollution comes from transportation and commuting.
I'd also add that every home that isn't built here, that isn't built in the Bay Area or Los Angeles, I think it's sometimes talked about as though the people who would live there just cease to exist.
Yeah.
But of course they don't. They exist now, and what happens instead is either they continue to have roommates that they don't really want or can't move out of their parents' home, or very often homes are built somewhere where building housing is allowed for them, like the desert in Phoenix or Las Vegas or somewhere that is actually much worse for the environment.
Well, we in Ojai, because of the Ojai area plan, which I've been working on, actually prevented any houses from being in our unincorporated area as well, which is like twice the size. I would say in addition to that, the loss of students in our schools. We can't have the kind of quality of schools because the primary funding in California, thanks to Proposition 13, is state funding. $15,000 for every student we get. So somehow we had housing for 100 students. That's $1.5 million more in our budget. And our school's in a major funding crisis right now. We have been losing students that whole period that we didn't build any housing. The other issue that people talk about is traffic. You know, as Susan said, we're a compact city. If you build on a lot of these empty lots near downtown, people can walk. You know, it'll help the shops. And of course, they won't have to commute. And the final thing, kind of related to that, when you build more densely, you use less water and less energy per person than you do when you spread out. And I would mention two things that were brought up during the whole issue with the development agreement that I just need to correct. One is water. Of course, the town doesn't provide water. That's the Casitas water system. I've had talks with them. Housing is not a problem with water in the city of Ojai. It's a very small use of water. We get, I think it's 10 acre-feet per year for well serve from the Casitas. We're not using anywhere near the amount of water that we're allocated. So to say that there's some kind of water crisis, you know, have you ever heard Casitas people come here and say, we got a water crisis, you got to stop building? No. This is a made-up defense to not actually doing affordable housing. And the second one was CEQA, the environmental review. That does not apply to areas that are less than 5 acres, and it doesn't apply to infill. That was brought up the other night, that, we need to do this massive CEQA analysis, and what came out was going to cost us $250,000 to do it. That would basically kill any affordable housing. So anyway, that's just a little sermon there. Now I'll take your questions. Wait a minute, I gotta read them.
Look at the cards.
I'm going to. That one doesn't seem to have a question. Ojai is a small valley bounded by mountains. Highway 33 is the main route into and out of the valley. It can only carry so much traffic, so when does the building of more homes have to stop?
I don't know. I mean, but
I
you should
think I
start
can answer
first.
that question because I dealt with it. I can answer that question. Actually, we've had no increase in commuting on Highway 33 in 2 decades. And I've checked with the facts when we got the change of the county. When you build houses in Ojai for middle income and less, that means people who work in Ojai don't have to commute. So, you know, what's happening now, the people from LA that are buying the houses and fixing them circulate in the same houses. You know, they're not bringing more people in, and as they circulate them, the price just keeps going up and up and up. So anyway.
Excuse me, but that isn't our experience. In fact, many people commute to Ventura in order to find a job. We have 3 children, and they've recently all graduated from college. They have jobs, and it's very difficult to find a job in the Ojai Valley. People leave town, just like they come into town for jobs, they leave town for jobs.
Well, that is true, and it's always been true. Actually, if we have some business diversity, maybe we could get jobs here rather than just all tourism. But yes, people do leave, and kids often of parents have to live in their parents' house in order to be able to.
And I think it's, you know, I don't think we ever have to frame this as like building housing or doing anything that needs to be done is without trade-offs. There are always trade-offs. And, you know, it comes down to the question of if home prices are $1 million now, is avoiding that traffic, which, you know, even without building homes over the past few decades, like, has traffic gotten worse? I would bet that it has. What price are we willing to pay? Are we willing to wait until prices are $1.5 million or $2 million and continue to export more home building to the suburbs of Phoenix and Dallas and so forth? There are trade-offs, but the reality is that people do adapt and they find ways to make use of the infrastructure that we have. They will carpool. They will find other, you know, means of getting around. Again, I don't want that to imply that it won't cost people something, but people are paying, you know, to Jeffrey's point earlier, like the status quo has extraordinary costs, and we have to compare those against doing something. Not just, well, this will have some negative impacts, and so we just have to discount all the negative impacts of the status quo.
So the average house, I learned from Eric Wild at the Rotary Club in his report on housing, the average sale price of a new home in the Ojai Valley, and that's probably higher in Ojai because Ojai is more expensive than the rest of the valley. Oh, okay. Oh, yes, okay, up Thatcher Road and so forth. You're right. Anyway, the average price in 2021 was $1.5 million. That's pretty extraordinary.
We also have to take into account that what's happened in the past 2 years is a lot more people are now working from home and not commuting either direction.
Yeah,
that is true. And someone brought up the issue of
myself included.
Because I was arguing about the need for having commercial in the unincorporated areas, like stores, so you wouldn't have to drive to Ventura. But someone brought up, well, look at all the Amazon vans and so forth. Well, you think about that, actually, it's a sustainable thing because one Amazon truck is bringing in supplies for 20 houses. And if all those people had to go on the road to drive to Ventura to Walmart or whatever, I mean, that's a lot of saved trips, actually. So maybe the change in the way we're buying is actually might help us. How about boarding houses, rooming houses, hostels? Build for a few low-income people. They would be allowed, would they? I guess they would be allowed in Ojai under the SRO, what is that?
Single room occupancy.
Single room, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And co-op, single room occupancy, yeah, they put it on here. Also, I believe every new building in Ojai Valley should be required to be plumbed for gray water recovery and distribution to the trees and the plants near the new buildings.
Yes,
Laundry water, showers, bath water should be conserved and used. I'm only going to read one half, that's a long one. I'll come back to the second half later.
Again, I don't have anything to add on the water stuff, but I can talk about the boarding houses, SROs, that kind of thing. This is something that has gotten, rightly, a lot more attention in the last 5 years or so. Basically, this recognition that starting 50 years ago or so, well, let's go back 100 years when boarding houses, flop houses, SROs, all these things, rooming houses were very common, and they were a place that people who had newly moved somewhere, or were only there temporarily, or were just poor and didn't really have other options, could stay and have actual shelter and house. It was housing. And for a variety of reasons, we just made those illegal. And it was sort of this idea of, well, that is not the way we want people to be living. Partly, well, there were sexist reasons related to that. There were racist reasons for that. There were just kind of, the nuclear family should look like this kind of reasons. But ultimately what happened is we said, we want that single family home to be the ideal, and took away these other options, but we didn't actually make it easier, didn't do anything for the people who had relied on those options to find something else. It was sort of like if we just said, Corollas aren't nice enough cars, Camrys aren't even nice enough. We're going to mandate that we're only going to build Lexuses from now on. We're not going to give you any money to buy a Lexus. We're just going to we're not going to build anything else. And that's really what we did with housing as well. And so there's this appreciation that, those homes, even if we, at this point in our life or whatever, might not want to live in them, like, who cares? We don't have to. Someone will benefit from this. And it is better for them to have that option than not to have that option if we're not going to give them a bunch of money, basically, to live in something we deem more appropriate. And I don't think we should, because I'm not really sure, beyond a certain level, like the government saying everyone needs to live in single-family homes or any kind of housing goes down a dark road. Giving people some amount of choice is probably a good thing.
Let me just say something about that first part of that question, because an organization called the Pacific Institute looked at Southern California and found that most cities could save about a third of their water with the kind of programs you're talking about. So an example, the San Diego was paying homeowners to eliminate their lawns. And they went from 90% lawns to 10%. Wow. Of course, they were paying them something that we could never pay, $4 a square foot. So that's kind of high. But anyway, there are, we think of energy retrofit programs. There could be water use retrofit programs. It's a matter of just us getting organized and finding where the source of that kind of money would be. And the Ojai Valley, and I know that.
That's enough for
Okay,
10,800 units, so.
let me move on. Communities similar to Ojai that have benefited from the building affordable housing, the result, what subsidies, etc., were used?
So the main source of funding for below market housing is the federal low-income housing tax credit, and oftentimes, depending on whether you get the 4% or the 9% tax credit, you're probably paying for they're probably covering 30 to 70% of the cost of construction and development and everything. So often you have to find other sources. You can get a loan for some of it, but you also often have to have local funding or county funding or region or whatever, and state. So transfer taxes are actually an increasingly popular one. There's maybe a dozen Bay Area cities that have these. You already pay a transfer tax right now. It's just low. It's
$1.10 per thousand.
Yeah. Well, there's a county and a city, but you might only have the county here one or something.
We don't have a city.
Okay. Most places, it's like the city is 0.45% and the county is 0.11%, so it adds up to 0.56%. The cities that have enacted progressive ones, so they are escalating as the value of the property goes up. So you might have, under $1 million, you're paying 1%. Between 1 million and 2 million, it might be 2%. Might go up to 4 or 5% at the highest range. So, if a property sells for $100 million, which, a new large-scale development in big cities is not uncommon at all, you're talking $3 to $5 million just in one hit from that sale, and that can then subsidize, dozens of units or hundreds of households rent assistance for years. There's a lot that can be done. I wrote actually a report on the potential of this in LA, but it's sort of a more general case for progressive transfer taxes. partly as a way to make up for the losses that Prop 13 imposes by keeping people's property taxes at the level at which it was when they bought their home. And this is like extremely inequitable policy where you have, you know, a household might make more than the new residents, but they're paying 0.2% effective property tax, and their neighbors are paying the full freight 1%, despite, you know, regardless of how much money they make or anything else. So we can't do much about Prop 13, unfortunately, and efforts have been made, but transfer taxes are a possibility, and they have proven quite popular, actually.
Could you read my question again so we get the answer?
What was the question? One I just read?
Yeah.
An example where.
An example where, looking for an example where that places have benefited from affordable housing and what kind of subsidies we use.
Similar to Ojai.
Similar to Ojai. Do you know any places that have been successful?
Facts, kind of just some real examples.
Yeah, and even talk about these non-existent subsidies.
Yeah, and I actually asked similar, like, some examples of how it helped these communities and what subsidies did they use? Like facts. Like, do you have that information? Cities, facts, examples? Because it's kind of confusing.
I think they're looking at if there's other best practices from cities of similar size.
This money, I don't know from smaller cities, I'm sorry. Like, it's not any different, though, is the reality. And you're perfectly eligible for... It's fair, but you're perfectly eligible for these federal tax credits, and you would be entirely reliant on them. You will not get low-income housing built without it, with direct subsidies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Most.
I have something to say. Bill Donnie, People's Self-Help Housing, which is a nonprofit organization, been in existence for 50 years. They have 50 development units that they run in San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara, and a few here now. They are an answer.
Well, and Habitat uses subsidies. Most every nonprofit developer who does that kind of thing, that's their job, is to find all the subsidies so they can make it work.
Yeah. Community development block grants are common.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of us actually putting some energy into actually finding this and being willing to do it, really. Well, this is kind of the same question. What subsidies are available for very low income folks, which I guess Section 8? Would you require low or very low income units for displaced tenants to move to before they are evicted to build new and more expensive units? Many of the problems caused by little affordable housing overall. Workers can't afford. Ojai school systems losing students and loss. Okay, but I think the key one is that first part of the question.
Subsidies for like rent assistance?
The question was what kind of subsidies for very low people, rent assistance, and then what do you do to help people who are being displaced and evicted from their houses?
On the rent assistance side, certainly housing choice vouchers are the number one resource for this. This is formerly known as Section 8 housing vouchers. They pay the difference between 30% of your income and what the rent actually costs, but only up to about 40% of the sort of median rent in your city generally. So it's the kind of not like really crappy housing, but the lower tier. So lots of neighborhoods you just won't be able to rent in. Not to mention a lot of landlords, despite it no longer being legal, they will still reject people who try to pay with housing choice vouchers. So that really is the main source. And unfortunately, only about a quarter of households that are eligible for those vouchers actually receive any because they're not adequately funded at the state level. Things like Medicare, food stamps, these are entitlements where if you are eligible, you can get it. Rent assistance is not one of those entitlements, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And Susan has some experience with that. Tell us about it.
Well, I applied for Section 8 during COVID because I couldn't teach. It was too complicated with masking. sterilizing everything. And so I got very excited when I got a voucher for it was good for $1,950. Unfortunately, there isn't any housing for that price.
People
Yeah.
who are watching the video can't hear when you let people talk without a microphone.
It's up to you for work every month and all that, but I don't expect to be able to use it.
Yeah, yeah. There was another question about using. Sure.
And even if it's illegal to refuse it, when you have 20 people applying for a
I've been
house-
asked by the newspaper for videotaping this to let people who's speaking be heard.
Stand up. Okay. All right, so the question was about Section 8 vouchers, and evidently they do have worked in the past for people, but now the rent is so high, my voucher for $1,950, which I first interpreted that I could subsidize the difference. If the apartment was $2,400, I just pay the difference. But I was told I could not pay the difference, and I now regret not taking that apartment without the voucher, because that same apartment 9 months later has gone up at least $1,000, at least. So if the voucher is for $1,950, say for one bedroom, a little more for the, if there isn't anything available at that price, it doesn't do you any good.
Right.
You can actually, maybe they were misinformed or you misheard, but you actually can rent in units above the fair market rent cap. You pay the full difference though. So if you can only pay, say, $500 a month, and that's 30% of your income, and they pay the difference up to the 1,900 something, you can still, if the rent, say rent is 1,900 and that's the cap, the most they'll pay, but the unit is 2,100. So if your 30% is 500, and then they pay up to 1,900, you pay 200 more to get to 2,100. You can do that.
Okay, so I need to challenge the worker that was, because it never made sense. And then I was going to go to the board, actually, of the Area Housing Authority.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for clarifying that, because I need to find out which of that is true, because then I could have had housing, ages ago.
So one thing that came up, which I don't think most people know this, that it is illegal in California now to discriminate against Section 8.
Right.
So I think the city or somehow we need to get that across to landlords and have some way that tenants are aware of this. Because from what Susan said,
In practice, the challenge is, and
that doesn't work always.
That law was, I think, passed in 2019 or 2020. It was very recent, and it's great. And there's very good evidence that places that have those laws on the books that prevent that kind of discrimination, they have much higher acceptance rates for people with vouchers. They don't eliminate the discrimination entirely, in part because it is very hard to prove. Unless someone is putting on their Craigslist ad or something like no Section 8 tenants, but they still do, even in places where it's illegal, because they just don't know any better. Like a lot of small landlords just don't know any of the rules, and they break them constantly without realizing it. But it does help. So, but this is actually a case where having very limited supply and low vacancies makes it even harder. Aside from it causing prices to rise more quickly, it also means landlords have a ton of options. And so, without explicitly saying, I'm not going to take a voucher, they can just find someone who is going to pay the rent without a voucher. And, putting aside the kind of racism tinged and classism aspects of denying kind of as a class people with vouchers, there's also a reality that it is more difficult to rent to them because you have to get the housing authority to inspect the unit beforehand. So it's not a huge burden, but it is an extra step that landlords have to go through by taking someone with a voucher. And so this is where it's really good to have a lot of competition for landlords, so they just have to take it rather than being so discriminating.
Follow-up question here.
Back to the, this is really personal and also to many people in the room.
The projects that are being proposed here that had such a big community turnout lately, the issue for many of us, I'm a retired person on a fixed income, there is no place to go when the projects are built. They're going to build something like 60-some units and 5 low or very low units, and they're going to evict quite a few, 30, I don't remember how many. People are going to be evicted. There's even some nice money packages for the tenants who'll be evicted, but there'll be no housing for us to go to here in town. So, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have a good answer for the individual case because, like, especially when there's nowhere to go. Like, what are they supposed to do about it? But this is where, coming back to the higher level about how we plan our cities, there has to be more housing being built in places that don't require displacement of tenants, right? Like, there's a lot of places that are either commercial or they are owned, they're lived in by the owner, like a single family home or what have you. And in those cases, if you build more housing there, it's entirely voluntary when they leave. They've sold to the person who wants to build there, as opposed to the owner of a multifamily structure selling to a developer, and the renters are just kind of this third party who kind of pays the cost. So, I mean, I don't have a great answer because if there's not housing,
He has an answer.
where
He has an answer.
Yeah.
Shane,
I have an answer.
what I see the problem is, Shane, what I see the problem is that we've got 3 city council people here. When you talk to the people, except for this one who's new, you talk to the people on our planning commission, you know what they say? Everything that comes before us is because of parking conflicts. We've owned city property, we've confiscated city property, we've had people try to convert ADUs, and we smacked everybody down because of parking. And I think it's time, if these people want to have, these council people want to have any affordable housing, drop the parking. When there's no parking, they'll do something different. What they do is they're artificially making this place unaffordable because they refuse to change the rules.
Okay.
And they haven't even tried it.
Okay, well, I promise.
He's Mr. Pissed Off.
Hold on, he's responding as a
I'm
council.
gonna get back to the cards.
First of all, I think we have to all agree that developers are not going to afford, are not going to build low income or very low income housing. It's not in their interest. So you got to accept that going into the discussion. The second thing is, cities don't build housing either. What cities can do, though, is we can purchase land, and we in turn can find entities that do that. And that was part of the discussion that wasn't real clear last Tuesday at the last council session, was what the 2 council people in the ad hoc committee were trying to achieve didn't quite meet the standard of the community, but are going back to take another shot at it. Part of that shot is looking at the land that the city actually owns. We own 5 or 6 or 7 parcels that are buildable. I met with Mr. Miley here last Sunday. We walked for 3 hours on one of them. I'm just saying that we can help solve this problem if we're all willing to work together on doing that and recognizing what our role as the government is and the role of the community, which is to support what we're trying to achieve. We tried putting in 40 units right back here. That was 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was a SPL overlay. We had the zoning for it. And then the community came out and said, how dare you take one of our parks to put affordable housing in? So it's a constant battle, but we got to recognize that there is a need because obviously we don't have housing. But what cities can do is we can look at the parcels that we do own. And I am
can't talk directly to Councilman Wyler because he's on the ad hoc committee, but I can strongly suggest that in the negotiations that we look at what parcels we have in the community that we could actually develop either with self-help housing, Cabrillo, or a couple of these entities that do very low and low income housing, and try and get that on the front end so that there is no displacement of anyone in this community, and we do this together.
And there was an earlier question too, which I didn't get to answer, about displacement and whether there's a way to provide housing for people who are evicted and have that on hand. And I think that's absolutely possible. It's a long-term project. I guess a short-term answer is that rather than having this housing built, you can also acquire housing. Then it's just a matter of like, well, there's probably already people living there, and you can't move them out in favor of someone else. But over the long run, I do think, and I've advocated for this, when people are facing displacement for a redevelopment or something like that, giving them priority access to the below market units you have, or even, if they can afford more than that, other units, but making sure that they're just not going to be, have no options or have to, find a below market unit elsewhere. That's something that certainly can be done. And we'll note there are some Fair Housing Act rules that have to do with placing people into below market deed restricted units. You can't just choose, kind of specific people or specific kind of classes of people. There are serious laws kind of restricting this a little bit, but it's my understanding that something like saying, if someone is facing eviction through no fault of their own because of a redevelopment, for example, we're going to give them priority access. And usually there is at least 6 months to a year, maybe the rules are different here, where you have to give people notice before you evict them in that kind of situation. And so that should give enough time to find a place for people.
Okay, I promised we did through the written ones. It's exciting that everybody is so animated by this issue, because I think it's something that we needed to have been animated about it for quite a long time. How about, please comment, tiny houses, housing projects, or homeless sites for shacks or huts of homeless, I'm not sure I'm reading this, I'll say people, like Dignity Village in Oregon or Washington. Okay.
I don't know those specifically, but tiny homes, this is sort of a variation on, it's sort of a modern incarnation of SROs and boarding houses and these kinds of things. So I think there's absolutely a place for them. A nice thing about that kind of model is you can stand them up almost immediately. It doesn't take a lot of prep. Don't even necessarily, if the city leads on it, which they can do. LA has put a lot of basically like trailer type things that were converted into shelters and homes in different situations. Because it's the city, it still takes months and months to do, but it's better than years and years. And they've provided, I think, hundreds of homes at this point through those different models. So it certainly should be part of the solution. Something.
I want to speak to that particular issue because we have a pilot program that Susan and I sponsored for a tiny home project where they can choose to use their ADU zoning as in the form of a tiny home. And what I'm hearing, and I'm going to go right back to Mr. Daddy on this, what I'm hearing is that the insurance industry will not insure the tiny home as ADU. In fact, it's telling the property owner that if they try to put an ADU and they to self-insure it, they won't insure the primary residence. Why does the insurance commissioner allow that?
That's the wrong company.
No idea. Cannot answer that question.
Well, we are seeing some, I think this is stop, let me get out of the way.
I think that's an insurance commissioner angle. That's all you look at.
I think we see lots of barriers, and we need to be thinking creatively how to get past them. I mean, one example we just heard recently was, requiring a sprinkler for an ADU in their backyard kind of thing. So we need to look at all.
State Fire Marshal edict on that against
Yeah, we need to look at all our rules to try to.
That's my question, we allowed an Airstream village for tourists here in town. If we can do that, why can't we allot a parcel of land for tiny homes for low, extremely low income people? Especially when we've got a bunch of people who are gonna be displaced with this new housing development.
Okay, I guess you've sort of already answered that. Yes, we can, obviously.
Why aren't we? Why can't we? He says that we can't get the insurance.
Well, we need more people like you going down to City Hall asking for yes than people going down saying no. That's our problem.
But I
Every
agree
time
with
we
the
do
comment.
anything,
It
there's
probably is
no.
an insurance commissioner thing, because I doubt the city itself could change that rule, such that a company, an insurance company would change its
We just
practices.
came for the but we approved Airstream.
I mean, it's worth trying as a starting point, but you might have to go higher to get that changed.
Airstream trailers for tourism.
Right.
Why can't we have a parcel for tiny homes, which are almost the same thing, or else just have a trailer place? But tiny homes are a little more dignified.
That's true, but also when we do a film or something, sometimes we create a city in a week. We literally, it's all out there. Home, this place to sleep, cafeteria, everything done.
All right.
So I think we can adapt that to, like, really hit my heart where there's no place to go. We can make some place to go within weeks with the help of the city. We can literally can create a nice little community to help these people while other things are going comfortable and healthy and everything right.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
we do that all the time. We create cities overnight.
So there's one lady with a hand up and a lady over here asked earlier. Do you still have a question?
Hi, my name is Betsy Watson. I'm on the Area Housing Authority as one of Ojai's 2 representatives. And I really want to bring some housing to Ojai, but you know the story. But I wanted to say something about the housing choice voucher. That is a common misunderstanding. And one thing that came out during the pandemic was the landlords who had renters with the housing choice voucher, they got their money through the entire pandemic. You heard about these landlords that couldn't make their mortgage, et cetera, because the people weren't paying and they couldn't be evicted, so forth. But the ones that had the housing choice voucher renters got their money straight through where other people didn't. So it's a good program for the landlords. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, you could argue that it's a stability that you don't have with sometimes if you're at the lower end of
Definitely
rentals.
It's the most reliable tenant there is, the U.S. federal government.
They're not nobody's going to give up their housing choice voucher. And did you have a question, Megan? Keep it short.
Yes, no, I like the idea of like Airstream and tiny homes and all that stuff, but I live in the cabins, the Mallory cabins, and same with the cottages. And so there's 30 units, right? There's 30 units that the developer wants to tear down, and he wants to tear down 24 of the units that are already there, in place, with people living in them, that are already low income and very low income for some. So I'm not understanding like why in a town we would knock something down that we already have to build for people that can afford market rate and above, like $100,000. They make like $100,000 a year. So that's just my statement. And if you have a statement back to me on that as to why, what's the sense of that? We already have 30 units of low income.
Yeah, and this is why in my stability policy section, I mentioned like limiting these low yield redevelopments. I think it's just not the kind of project that is adding as much. When we could do projects like that, presumably somewhere else where that level of displacement is not happening. But again, I do want to take us back to kind of the policies and the systems, like not to dismiss what you're saying at all, but just recognizing how the decisions are causing these outcomes today. I can pretty much guarantee you most of the city, that kind of development is not allowed. And your neighborhood, your parcel is probably one of the few places where higher density development is allowed. and because prices have gone up so much, no, I can guarantee you, almost every city in the U.S., 80+% of parcels, residential parcels, allow 1 unit. Period.
They got a density bonus because they were building affordable units in another part of town,
Mm-hmm.
and parceled the 4 parts together in one project, a
Yeah.
10-year project.
But it's still
Yeah.
low.
This is, there's more to this. This is a
Way more to this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
First of all,
There always is. Every project is so
cottages
unique.
and bungalows have historical significance. Those are 2 ideal properties to be purchased by a housing trust,
Mhm.
and so that we can maintain them. And the other issue, because I've lived here like 67 years, and I've seen every few years they demolish due to strategic neglect the low-income houses. This is the last. These 2 properties are the last of our truly low-income housing, and I'm going to do everything I can to preserve them. You know, and it can be done. It can be done. It's the only thing that makes sense.
Let me follow up on that because, we have a land trust here in the valley. A land conservation trust. Probably got $20 million worth
In the
of
county.
land.
It's the county.
But it's in the valley.
Right.
The Ojai Land Conservancy. That's what I'm talking about, land conservancy. They conserve land to do what? The heights. And to protect endangered, it's a good thing, it's a great thing. It helps our valley, no question about it. But it's all volunteer money from rich people, and we got a lot of them here in the valley, have done it for preserving nature. Why can't we get some of those same rich people to do a land trust that could buy those properties? And, our housing trust. A land trust is kind of a subdivision of a housing trust because it actually buys the land and you deed restrict it. But anyway, that's something we need to start talking about because we can't be saying to private developers, you can't do what you want with your private property unless we're willing to buy it. Really, that's what it comes down to. And I think we need to get serious about how big an issue this is in the Ojai Valley. Do you have a question back there?
You know, you can triple the size
Wait
of
a minute, Bob, it's not your turn.
Yeah, the mic.
Bring the mic.
Take the
Come
mic.
back here, come up so I can get the mic.
Speak loud enough, trust me.
No, not for the video.
This is on video, stand up.
I don't want to be on video.
Too bad.
I'm just curious, with these parcels that the city owns, what would it take to work with HUD to build something like Whispering Oaks on those parcels for truly people that, right now, for years, Whispering Oaks' waiting list has been closed. It opens for 5 days and it's closed again, and then people wait for years on that list to get into a housing project that's funded by HUD.
We had it and the people voted, the people didn't want it.
The people, what people?
Well, we don't want to be stuck in the past. Let's talk about what we can do going forward.
That's what I'm talking about, that's not.
Shane, one of the supply issues that I think is underutilized is, remember there was a state law passed a few years ago. It said that school districts could use surplus land or land that they have available for building workforce housing with a preference for school and staff. Our school district has basically refused to consider that option, even though they have a massive declining enrollment and lots of land available for that kind of thing. Do you have examples of school districts that have taken advantage of that law that you're aware of?
I haven't followed school district development. I think the city of Los Angeles, actually no, I do know San Francisco just did this, I forget what neighborhood. But I just saw a headline of an article, I don't know, maybe 100 units or so that they built right near or on a school.
There's lots of
I will say though that I'm 100% supportive of that. It also is not free. Even workforce housing requires subsidies because when it costs $500,000, $700,000 a unit, and you're not going to get costs under that if existing housing here is over $1 million. New development is basically the cost of new development is essentially a function of the cost of existing housing, and so the worse things get, in the
But
market,
the key
the
is
more it
it's a
costs to
legal
build.
preference you can have for faculty and staff to help recruit.
Yeah.
And,
And if you can get the subsidies for that, and you don't have to have as deep of subsidies because teachers make more than, they're not low income, but they're also, they couldn't afford a market.
The Ventura Unified School District, James Forsythe was here and I heard him speak. They are actually looking at a lot of their surplus land to potentially put housing on, but we have not had that same motivation. But we do have a school board race coming up, and there's 3 seats on the board, and it will be the majority. So if you go out and vote for the right people that are committed to something like this, you could possibly have it done. You got another question?
Well, it was the same question, because it wasn't answered. We moved on to school property immediately.
It's an option. It's one option, and there are lots of them. We just need to get dedicated to doing them. No one option is going to do it. But yes, it's a good option. The what? Oh, I thought they were duplicated, but there was one that I didn't. They were sounding all the same. So if you got a question, go ahead and say it. Because I was trying to read his card. Your card.
It's my card, yeah, thank you. So my question is, have you seen anything creative done for communities where everybody wants to move there to prioritize folks that already live there? As we build new houses, and I have to tell you, so my neighborhood, which is a regular old neighborhood, it's not fancy. So 5 out of the 6 adjoining homes to my house are our second homes or third homes, where we only see the people once every 6 or 8 or 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So
we have no regulations on second house.
So what have you seen other towns, not giant metropolises, but have you seen other towns that have creative ways of prioritizing the people that already live there?
It's not legal, frankly, is the problem. It would violate the Fair Housing Act to do just about anything in that vein.
And the Commerce Clause.
It's just really difficult. I do think you can discourage these second homes and things like that by taxing them. And I think even the city would have control over that. But this is not something I've heard much about because I think you get into such dicey legal territory. Even in big cities, I haven't really heard of this being done.
So if we build, there's we're not, I feel in a way like we're not building for those of us that.
Well, here's the thing.
There.
I have looked this up because it's a very common concern, and I think, understandable, that when we build new housing, well, it's just for someone who's moving here, it's even attracting people to our city. And there is not a lot of evidence for that. The fact is, people... No, please listen.
Well, you got to remember, we haven't built anything for 20 years.
If you don't build something, they're just going to move into the existing housing, which is exactly what's happening. That is my point. It's not that they don't move here at all. It's just they move into the existing housing. And I've looked at this across the country. If you look at homes built in the last couple of years versus homes built prior to 2000, just to pick dates, the percentage of people that moved in the last year into one set or the other from a different metro area, it's almost exactly the same. People don't come to a new city because they learned that they were developing new housing that they really like and wanted to buy it. They decide they want to move somewhere because they get a job, because they're retiring, because they're going to school, any number of reasons. I'm sure many people here have moved. You figure out where there's something motivating you to move to a place. And once you've decided to move, then you look for housing. And if there is new housing available, you might move into that rather than taking up space in existing housing. But it's very uncommon for people to be attracted to a place just because housing is being built.
I'm not saying that's what's going on. I'm just wondering, it seems like the supply issue, and I agree about the three-legged stool, but the supply issue for Ojai build more houses, but it doesn't necessarily provide housing for people that.
But we haven't tested that because we haven't built any houses. 5 houses in 12 years. Eric Wild, who gave the speech about whether we would be worried about a crash in our housing market, he said there's no way because we have no supply. And as long as there's demand, the price of houses are going to keep going up. Think about though, what if you built everything that's being built is rental and it's under 1,500 square feet? People aren't going to buy that as gigantic vacation homes. Well, to limit their amount, there's ways of doing that as well. Did you got a question, Bill?
No, I have an answer.
An answer? Oh my gosh.
Give him the mic.
Let's make this the last one because we're probably getting exhausted.
It's just getting good.
But it's been good. We need to keep it up. I'm not against that. But anyway, Bill, Mr. Housing.
So to talk about the issue of priority, you're working with people's self-help housing in the past. We were able to develop a plan so that workforce housing was a priority for people who were working within the city limits of Ojai.
The top of the mic.
If they lived here and were paying more than 30%, they got 2 points. If they worked here and lived someplace else, they got 1 point. So it wasn't a case where we were opening up affordable housing and then people from all over who wanted to live there came. It was a dedicated priority system for people who are here, just like Heidi was saying.
That is a good point. With deed restricted housing, there are some incremental ways you can sort of favor people, and they tend to be limited to people who already live in the city anyway, in those cases. But that's going to be a pretty small share of housing, just given the cost of it. But that is an important point, that especially the deed restricted housing is a little easier to reserve in that way for people who live in the city or the region. Deed restricted is a legal requirement. So it's when it's subsidized or when there's a requirement with like this development agreement that it has to be reserved to people within a certain income range, and rented at a price that is affordable to people within that income range for at least 55 years in California.
It was exactly the 2 different situations we were facing with this development agreement. All the quote affordable were what I'll call naturally affordable, which means that they are substandard, they are too small, that's why they're inexpensive. They weren't fixed up. The developer at any point could decide, I'm going to fix them up and charge you more.
They already had a permit to demolish everything with no affordable housing.
The only technically affordable housing is deed restricted, which means it cannot become unaffordable for 55 years. One of the reasons you do land trusts, because they tie that to it and they own the land. So that's the difference between those 2 types of housing. And the only way we can do deed restricted is either negotiate with the developer like what's happening here, some kind of trade-off, or we have a self-help housing or land trust or some subsidized thing where we buy the land and we build something. So I want to thank everybody. It's been very exciting and informative. And why don't we give Shane a round of applause for tolerating a very spirited Ojai, as usual.
That's housing, baby.
Well, we're that way with everything. So